So, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome again. And now we are going to begin with the first session, which is on apparel sourcing trends in the new normal. And the session will be moderated by Mr. Robert Antoshak, CEO Textile Projects. And our panelists for this session are Ms. Julia Hughes, President, United States Fashion Industry Association, Ms. Deepika Rana, Chief Customer Officer and President of Supply Chain Solutions, Lee and Fong, Mr. Andrew Ola, CEO, Ola Incorporated, and Mr. Alex Helander, CEO, ACH LLC. Our distinguished moderator, Mr. Robert Antoshak, is the CEO of the Textile Projects as independent consulting firm in Nashville, Tennessee, USA. And Mr. Antoshak advises various companies in the textile and apparel supply chain with activities focused on M&A, private equity, investments, market research, and sourcing. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I hand over to our distinguished moderator for this session, Mr. Robert Antoshak, CEO Textiles Projects, to kindly give his opening remarks.
Hello. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the Confederation of Indian Textile Industry and their knowledge partner, GTC, for inviting me to participate in today's important event. I'm Robert Antoshak, CEO of Textile Projects, LLC, a consulting firm based in Nashville, Tennessee, USA, specializing in textile and apparel market research, strategic marketing, communications, and mergers and acquisitions. You may learn more about me from my blog, fromfieldtoshelf.com. It is my profound pleasure to join you today as moderator of a panel discussion entitled Apparel Sourcing Trends in the New Normal. As this is a virtual event, I have the honor of separately interviewing 4 leading experts in the global textile and apparel industry. So it is my privilege to introduce Ms. Julia Hughes, President, United States Fashion Industry Association, Ms. Deepika Rana, Chief Customer Officer and President of Supply Chain Solutions, Lee and Fong, Mr. Andrew Ola, CEO, Ola Incorporated, and Mr. Alex Helander, CEO, ACH LLC. Together, we will cover a wide range of topics of critical importance to textile and apparel companies in India and elsewhere. In particular, we will discuss the impact of COVID on the industry, key trends affecting global sourcing decisions, and India's position in the global industry, as well as many other topics. So now, on to the interviews. It's with great pleasure today that I welcome Julia Hughes, a longtime friend and colleague. Julia is president of the United States Fashion Industry Association. Hi, Julie. How are you doing today?
Great. Thank you.
Well, thanks for joining us. And let's just jump right in on these questions. We have a nice list of them for you. Could you talk a bit about the key trends and purchasing criteria for apparel sourcing that you're seeing from U.S. buyers these days?
Absolutely. And let me just start with saying, it's been a few years since I've been to India. I think it's probably going to be a few more. So I'm really happy to join virtually. Let's talk about the key trends. And I think it's really interesting talking with brands and retailers that even though we're still responding to the pandemic and the shifts in consumer demand and not quite sure when we're going to be out of this part of the cycle, the key sourcing criteria pretty much are staying the same. And, so there's really 6 factors that we hear about. And of course, with each company, it may vary on what's their top priority. Of course, speed to market, that remains a priority, and particularly when, for example, when we were really focused on PPE, that was super important. How could we get product here as quick as possible? Second criteria, sourcing cost. And everyone in the audience probably will groan. I mean, yes, that cost is a factor, remains a factor that is in the equation for every company. And then 2 risk factors, the risk of labor and social compliance issues that are factored in. and then the risk of environmental compliance issues, which has become more and more important for companies. And then finally, the criteria that I think is frankly the most important for the majority of brands and retailers today, and that's the flexibility and agility of the supplier. So, that ability, because of the relationships that we all have through the supply chain, to be able to shift what is the product, what is the color, what can you do to respond to consumer demand as quickly as possible. That's kind of an uncertain factor to be able to exactly weigh and assess, but is really important criteria for the sourcing decision.
I think even particularly with regard to COVID these days,
Yeah.
having that kind of flexibility,
Yeah.
right? I'm sure you're seeing that a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I had actually a government official told me the other day that they wanted to get some new sweatpants, and the online retailer that they went to, the sweatpants are back ordered until June.
Wow.
So I think that exactly
That says a
tells you
lot.
that
That says a lot. Yeah.
that's a long time for what's a pretty basic product, but one of the things that we all are buying more of during work from home.
That's for sure. So it seems that way,
Yeah.
without question. Um, Question I know is on everyone's minds are what's the new administration in Washington going to do with regard to trade? Is the U.S. going to come back into TPP? Are there going to be new FTAs? Are they going to stay tough on China on tariffs? What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's the big question these days. So let me share with the audience, kind of my thinking right now. So when President Biden took office, he said the administration would conduct a whole of government review of many of the policies of the previous administration. Now, I personally would have liked to see President Biden remove all the penalty tariffs, lift the tariffs on China and the tariffs on the EU on day one. But that didn't happen. And I have to admit that I think the best policy approach probably is to take that review of what's going to come next. On the trade front, so that covers lots of issues, but on the trade front, we're going to be a bit delayed, and this is normal whenever there's a new administration, because the president's team isn't in place yet. The nominee for U.S. Trade Representative is Catherine Tai, who some in the audience may have met before. There's no opposition that I have heard to her getting the nomination to be U.S. Trade Representative. She's terrific background. She used to work at USTR, and most recently she worked in the Congress and was the lead trade counsel at the House Ways and Means Committee, which is the House committee that oversees trade policy. So she's got a great background and she knows the issues, but she hasn't had her hearing yet. That probably will be happening shortly, maybe when you all are hearing this. And then it will take a little while until she's approved. So without the U.S. Trade Rep in place and without nominees for the deputies, it's not surprising that the administration hasn't taken action yet. So if they haven't taken action yet, but what is it that we think is likely to happen? I mean, I do think that at least some of the penalty tariffs will be lifted. And I do think that the new administration will look for negotiating more trade agreements and free trade agreements, but it's going to be slower than probably everyone in the audience would like. I won't get into some of the arcane discussion, but the authority for the administration to negotiate trade agreements expires this summer, and it's likely going to be probably a battle with the Congress before it's renewed. So, on the agenda for sure is the discussion of a trade agreement with India. I know we were close in the last administration, and I know that it is on the agenda, but I would not expect anything to happen substantively too quickly. We're really probably looking at those negotiations seriously getting going later this year, and maybe look at trying to conclude next year.
Could you talk a little bit about the China Xinjiang situation? That was started in the previous administration, and now the current administration is looking at doing,
Yeah.
evaluating that and what to do. Could you comment on that?
Sure. I mean, I will say for brands and retailers, this is probably the number one issue of concern. Um, you know, Obviously, brands and retailers, we have codes of conduct, and that includes no sourcing that would include forced labor in the supply chain. Companies that I've spoken with are pretty confident that they do not have forced labor in their supply chain, and they were not directly sourcing in the Xinjiang region in China. But the way that enforcement works with the U.S. government is that you know they're looking for what they call clear and convincing evidence, but they don't have to have proof. So right now, the enforcement that's going on is a focus for companies on how can they prove that what's in their supply chain is not made with cotton from the XUAR region and was not made in the XUAR region. Now, you know, this is another opportunity, I think, for Indian cotton producers. And I've heard from some companies that their manufacturers in China are using Indian cotton today. And my guess is that some of those sales will grow. But it's a tough issue. No one wants to be accused of doing business in a region where there is genocide. So I think it's a major concern. It has an impact on sourcing, and we're still seeing how that's going to play out.
Yeah, it's a really tough issue. I mean,
Yeah.
and is it your understanding that customs will or CBP will try to use some high profile seizures to kind of like make a point, or are they going to try to go like find some tech and go across the board, or a mix of both, or what's your sense of that?
Yeah, I wish I knew the answer to that. I mean, there's a lot of concern that, both the media and government enforcement officials are looking for some high profile companies, to if in this story, and that's a concern. It's not just an apparel story. It's not just a cotton story. There's other agricultural products and the tech industry that also has had production that's in this region. So, you put your finger on what's the biggest concern, and why earlier when I talked about a risk factor that sourcing executives are concerned about with labor and social compliance. This is exactly the example why now more than ever, compliance executives are really pressing hard on their vendors and in the supply chain to make sure that there's no evidence of forced labor.
Gotcha. When I look at the global market share of India in terms of global trade, it's been kind of hovering at about 5% per year, pre-COVID, for a number of years. As you look at the Indian textile and apparel industry as a sourcing hub, let's talk sourcing hub first, and then we can talk Indian market second. But firstly, as a sourcing hub for U.S. buyers in particular, what do you perceive to be the strengths of the industry, the opportunities, as well as the risks of sourcing?
Sure, thanks. That's a great question. I mean, it's a tough one to answer, but I mean, I want to start. I am pretty optimistic, frankly, and pretty positive on the potential for India. The Indian textile and apparel sector has the infrastructure, it has the trained workers, it has the technology to really take advantage of the opportunities that we anticipate as the US economy and the world economy rebounds from COVID and what we've been going through for the past year. So I think actually, I mean, this conference is perfectly timed because now is the time for that. I think US buyers are definitely taking a fresh look and are interested in more insights about the supply chain and sourcing opportunities in India. I mean, for the last few years, so even pre-COVID, there's been a substantial shift in sourcing. Many US buyers were moving production from China. They were moving production from China to diversify and not have too large a percentage of all of their imports in one location. the trade wars of the Trump administration and supply chain concerns really accelerated that shift. And, so now kind of looking at total textile production, meaning, right, raw cotton production, yarns, fabrics. I mean, I think India is, probably best placed, vertically integrated to attract new orders and meet the demands of the U.S. buyers.
I'm going to jump ahead to a question that we had received from the audience prior to this, and has to do with man-made fibers. And China, or excuse me, India, of course, is known as a large cotton, or it is the largest cotton producer now in the world. Large cotton infrastructure and textiles, yarns, and spinning, fabric production, and so forth. How about what are the attitudes of U.S. buyers towards buying garments made out of synthetics out of India?
Yeah, I mean, I want to answer this kind of in the positive frame, which is I think, again, this is a terrific opportunity. Most buyers, they think cotton when they think about India. When they think about the whole subcontinent, they're thinking about cotton, and it makes a lot of sense. But today, man-made fiber is critical in sourcing decisions, and especially blends. And so I think that's a real opportunity area for the blends. It's a growing market. There's a lot of consumer demand. And, once again, I think the Indian sector could be poised to take advantage. I know it's not always easy to move to the blends and to shift the type of fibers and fabrics that you're working with. But again, I think it's another opportunity area, particularly for sales to the U.S. market.
What's your sense of the Indian domestic market? Or opportunities for various global brands to participate in that market? What's your sense?
I'm probably not as knowledgeable about that, but I do know that for a number of brands, they're a little bit wary. I think there haven't been as many, super successful Western retailers that have been able to take advantage of the Indian market. So there should be an opportunity there. But moving that forward, I haven't heard that as a top priority. And
Okay.
Let's kind of come back to that maybe a year from now, I think, because the
Let's
two
see if there's an
go
FTA,
hand in
right?
hand.
Let's see if there's an FTA. Yeah.
Right. I mean, expanding the global sales of different types of products that often can help them to trigger more opportunities in the domestic market too.
Last question that I have has to do with the various neighbors in the subcontinent. How do you see India's competitiveness opposite other countries in the region who typically compete for the same buyer's attention in the U.S.?
I mean, obviously what India has going for it again is, it has all the production there. I mean, it has the size, so therefore it has more opportunities, more suppliers, more diversification potentially. Buyers continue to look at Bangladesh because of the cost issue. So when they're weighing sourcing cost, Bangladesh has always ranked well on that criteria. Plus, since the tragedy of Rana Plaza, there's been a lot of time, energy, and money that brands have put into improving the environmental compliance in Bangladesh. And once you make that type of investment, that does mean that some brands are pretty committed to staying with key vendors there. Pakistan is always very strong as well for cotton sector. And Pakistan has been doing pretty well actually through COVID, not suffering as big a declines as some of the other countries. And I just would also want to mention, when I was kind of just taking a fresh look at the data, to note that when we look at Sri Lanka, much smaller, obviously, but this model in Sri Lanka and the type of production they're doing is a lot of man-made fiber. So, potentially there are some opportunities there as well for, blending and for synthetic product. But what's really good, I mean, if I can just say, hearkening back to my days when I worked for a company that was sourcing, to have strength throughout the region, throughout the subcontinent, that's really valuable. That's another selling point. for the U.S. buyers.
It's terrific. Again, Julie, thank you very much for your time today. I'm sure everyone will appreciate your comments. They're very astute as always. And if people want to reach you after this conference, what's the best way? Through your website, or what's the...
You can always go to our website, usfashionindustry.com. You can email me, you can either email to our info account, which is info@usfashionindustry.com, because then if I'm not available, someone else can answer the question, or you can email me directly at jhughes@usfashionindustry.com. But would love to hear from folks. Once again, sorry to be seeing you virtually and not in person, but let's hope in a few years.
Indeed. Thank you, Julie, very much.
Okay. Thank you, Bob.
Okay, of course. Bye.
Bye.
I'm delighted today to welcome Deepika Rana to today's event. She's with Li & Fung. Hi, Deepika. How are you today?
Hi, Bob. Pleasure to meet you.
It's so nice to meet
Great
you.
weather we are having here. I'm in the
Yeah.
US with you, so
I know
a huge cold spell.
We're all freezing with snow.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
so amazing. But here we have it. So again, thank you so much for joining us at today's event. There's a lot of questions I know that I'd like to ask, and hopefully we can fit in our allotted time a lot of these questions. I think that of course the first question that always seems to be on everyone's mind these days in the industry is the impact of COVID, and what has that meant for the overall textile and apparel industry in the world? I mean, and do you see that as something that has fundamentally altered the industry permanently, or will there be changes that'll come out as a result, or will things just snap back to normal after a period of time? What is your opinion?
I think the impact that COVID has had on the health of people, organizations, and sentiments, and the world as a whole across geographies is irreversible. It was a shock initially, but if you reflect now, it's actually left us with ample learnings and some bright sparks and bright spots of what it helped us really see. The biggest of that is how we've been able to give our planet a pause almost and help it regenerate itself from all of the destruction we have been causing with regards to the sustainability of our planet. And in that same vein, it has helped us relook at our lives and build a different culture, learn to manage a work from home culture, which requires more tolerance of each other's lifestyles and more balance, actually, between flexibility of working hours and allowing people to manage their families. And it's also given us a greater understanding, appreciation, and desire to learn in terms of digital. And the digital era is here to stay. And of course, awareness of health, hygiene, wellness, and the great importance of our health that cannot be taken for granted. So maybe COVID is possibly one of the most devastating pandemics we would have experienced in our lifetimes and the world has experienced in this decade. But I think it has left us with great learnings for the better, but it has altered us irreversibly. And the outlook for the world in terms of recovery, of our industries, as well as the general markets, is positive. The pace of recovery may be slow in certain sectors like travel, entertainment, brick and mortar retail, but we've seen spikes in e-commerce, infrastructure, home improvement, home in general, and definitely the medical sectors. So there's a plus and minus of COVID that we should look at. The markets across the world are capitalizing on the positivity of sentiments and showing bullish trends. And then there are sectors that are lagging behind, but we're quite positive that they will catch up.
Okay. You are a supply chain expert, I know. And for me, I'm always fascinated by how supply chains adapt to this, to external shocks or unforeseen circumstances. How will global supply chains, in your opinion, react to, or how have they reacted, and how will they rebound in the future?
Mhm. So this external shock has actually been a Kickstarter that's forcing companies and people to rethink their strategies and adopt new ways of working, as we just spoke about, Bob. Of course, it's built greater resilience in sourcing networks, but deep learnings in terms of agility and adaptability of sourcing networks, and very practically avoiding dependence in any country. In the past, and I'm dating myself when I say this, but in the past, we used to always have a risk mitigation plan while sourcing,
Mhm.
avoiding more than a certain penetration with any vendor, any country, and then a balanced supply chain. We kind of lost that in the great dominance of China as
Mhm.
the world's factory. But now I think COVID geopolitical shocks have forced us to avoid dependence in any country, identifying vulnerable parts of the supply chain and adopting alternative sources of supply, and reviewing and upgrading the contingency planning that we are doing for customers as well as for retailers. Rebalancing apparel supply chains for greater responsiveness and flexibility
Mhm.
is becoming a cornerstone of future strategy right now. There is also moving production closer to market, um, embracing strategic partnerships between customers and their vendors, which has actually had a big dent in it in the recent past. Trust has been broken due to canceled orders,
Mhm.
vendors being left holding the ball,
Yep.
a lot of financial damage done on both sides. But what it has really led to is deeper partnerships with fewer customers and vendors, and a small number of financially sound partners that can help achieve faster, more responsive, and more sustainable supply chains.
That's terrific. That actually leads into my next question, and it has to do with India and India's role in the global in its industry. Over the last few years, pre-COVID, India was kind of locked into about a 5% market share of the
Mhm.
global trade in textiles and apparel. As to your point about uh, sourcing diversification that is occurring or will occur, has occurred already. Um, when you look at India, what do you perceive to be the strengths and opportunities as well as the risks of sourcing there?
Mhm. So the strengths I love to talk about and opportunities. India is rapidly growing industrial economy with availability of key resources such as land, power, water, manpower, as well as a conducive regulatory framework for industries in textiles and the apparel sector to thrive. India is also a vertically integrated apparel supply chain with key global fabric and cotton growing areas and sectors that dominate the industry in India. It also has a very, very youthful and mobile, agile population that is a really strong workforce that exists at labor rates that are very, very competitive in global supply chain. And then the presence of all levels of the manufacturing value chain, from fiber to finished goods, will really help India achieve far better growth rates than it has in the recent past. The Ministry of Textiles in our recent budget that was announced has also spoken about an increase in the textile business size from the current levels of about 170 billion to about 350 billion in 5 years by 2025, and then further to 650 billion by 2030. And they have come up with a slew of increase in investment incentives as well as policy support measures to enable that. So there is a greater awareness of India as a textile manufacturing partner and hub of the world, especially given the fact that textiles and apparel are the second largest employer of people in India.
Mhm.
And so looking at the employment rates, it has become a huge focus of the government, and the textiles minister has been a huge supporter of this. I think if you look at the global supply chains, some of the disadvantages of India is possibly the fact that it needs more scale to compete with. If you look at manufacturers in apparel in China and in Vietnam, which is the way the Koreans as well as the Chinese have managed their supply chain, uh, the size of the Indian manufacturers are definitely punching under their weight. It should be much bigger and much more industrialized if we have to really compete in the world. If you look at the way our mills are working, whether it's the Wellspuns or the Intergowns or the Tridents of the world, they are actually leading the world in terms of the quality as well as the industrial automation that they've put in. But apparel manufacturers really have a little way to go. And we hope that with the current measures that the government is giving the apparel sector, we hope that they will start increasing capacity, building more infrastructure to be able to manage to compete globally at a much higher level than they have been at the so far.
So is it fair for me to conclude that you're quite bullish on India?
I'm definitely bullish on India and the whole subcontinent, actually, given the fact that there is a move out of China. We are unsure right now about Vietnam. There's been some ups and downs with what Trump has said versus what Biden is going to say politically. And the only alternative, really, if you look at the key factors of production, cotton, it's one of the largest cotton growing countries in the world.
Yeah.
Non-cotton, that's man-made fibers, there are huge incentives that have been granted to be able to grow that area as well. Labor, it's got amongst the most skilled as well as the most competitive labor pools in the world. So, and then if you look at product development and anything that is a creative, minimum order quantities, agility, India really has and ticks all these boxes. What India really needs to do now is to build scale, to be able to build efficiencies in scale where they have far more than a handful of over $100 million turnover manufacturers in apparel. And then they will be able to compete globally and be able to give the capacity that the world needs right now in core manufacturing.
That's fascinating. Are there any key trends or purchasing criteria that you have seen for apparel sourcing from the brands?
Yeah. We all know that speed to market has been a big push from brands. But I think if you go beyond speed and you look at what retailers are actually looking for today, they're looking for agility. They're looking for adaptability to be able to look at which part of their assortment is selling and be able to make that switch in manufacturing, almost an on-demand manufacturing. I think these are the areas that the retailers are looking for. So the minimum order quantities become much smaller. Orders cannot be placed a year in advance. We have to allow the retailers to read their sales and then react to what is in the pipeline. And therefore, on-demand manufacturing, more agile manufacturing becomes the key very quickly for the future.
Definitely. Yeah, it does strike me as though it's changing quite a bit. And I don't know if the pandemic accelerated that. I think it was happening before that, but it does seem to be a very key element. You're certainly
I
right.
think also, sorry, Bob, sorry for
Yeah.
interrupting, but I think also the digital supply chains are going to become the norm. So digital transparency of the supply chain, which means if people can have a pull model instead of a push one, which means they speak to their ultimate consumers, see what they want, and then if they're able to pivot and have transparency on availability of raw materials, capacity, manufacturing, then that transparency end to end in a supply chain will be really critical going forward. Within that, we have to reduce costs for manufacturers in every which way we can to be able to get the best value in the product that they produce. So things like digital product development, instead of physical sampling reduces almost 10 to 15% of the cost of a garment. If customers can make decisions based on digital samples versus having sampling done in every color and then shipped overseas and then looked at in physical form, it not only adds speed, it also adds a lot of efficiency as well as cuts down the cost of manufacturing for the vendors as well. Managing their capacities, reducing their fixed costs will enable them really to give a really good first cost to the retailers and also give much more flexibility to them.
Okay. Last question I have for you is actually an audience question that's been sent to us early. So it has to do with Li and Feng's expectations from Indian suppliers, tier 1 and tier 2 supply chain partners. What should be the top 3 focus areas for those suppliers?
Um, that's a loaded question,
Yeah,
but
I'm sure it is. So, but
um, I think Li and Feng's expectations from the suppliers is really one of operational excellence. We are in our jobs today to execute and to be able to deliver the KPIs that our customers want from us, and we've got to do it in a compliant fashion as well as sustainably. So it's not just that you ship on time, you produce a quality product, you have the product development that the retailers want, but compliance and sustainability go out of the window. It's an all in one package that is required for the future. Um, Between tier 1 and tier 2 manufacturers, I think the essential difference really is one of scale. So the tier 1 manufacturers are the ones that drive efficiency and cost through their scale and through their infrastructure. The tier 2 manufacturers are far more nimble, far more fashion forward, are far more adaptive, and have a much more creative cornerstone to their thinking. The difference between the two doesn't need to be much more than that. So when it comes to quality and on-time shipping, that's a given. That's the base on which the orders are placed. And the difference between tier 1 and tier 2 should not be, even though it has traditionally been looked at in terms of the quality of product and the ability to ship on time. It should not be that going forward. It should really be one of scale and the size of the manufacturer and their ability to produce in terms of lead times.
terrific. Topeka, thank you so much for joining us today and participating in our event. Question: if anyone wants to reach you afterwards, how should they do that?
They're most welcome to reach me on my LinkedIn page.
Okay.
I have my profile on LinkedIn, quite active over there, so I welcome any questions from any of our viewers on that. And thank you, Bob. Thanks for your time today, and it's a pleasure to be on this webinar.
Thank you again. Thank you. So it's a real pleasure to welcome my friend and denim expert, probably one of the leading denim experts in the world, Andrew Ola, CEO of Ola Incorporated, to today's event. Andrew, how are you today?
I'm great, Bob, and I really appreciate you saying those nice things. And it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I think we're really fortunate to get you. So, thank you very much for participating. I have a couple of questions for you for the audience. And first is, what's your sense of the impact of COVID, or what the impact of COVID has been on the industry, and what's your outlook for industry recovery in light of that?
Well, I think that the impact of COVID has been enormous all over the world. As we know right now, Germany's retail stores are closed, and there's been closures in the United States, and nobody actually had plans for that. So it wasn't in anyone's budget. Maybe it is for this year. So those things have been, dramatic impacts, but also it's been an impact on the way we all live, and the amount of jeans that we're wearing as we stay home. I've been to the office probably this year, since March, probably 40 days. And I can't say that all the rest of the days I wore jeans. Whereas if I had worked all the time, I probably would have worn jeans every day almost. So I think that the impact has been, devastating in some ways, but in other ways, surprisingly good. Our denim sales figures for our company for the last 6 months have been down, but not down very much, and been quite consistent. And I've been quite surprised by that.
That's terrific.
I guess the outlook is obviously, if it was not so bad the last 6 months, the outlook for the second half of the year is much more positive, because I imagine in this country, they've already inoculated, I think, 45 million people, and we're operating at 1.5 million a day. So I would imagine sometime in July, August, early September, whoever wants to be vaccinated in the United States will have been vaccinated. And stores which were empty last Christmas retailers that were not going to work will open their stores this year, and there will be opportunities to go shopping.
Do you foresee a sharp rebound in the consumer expenditures? Once everyone's vaccinated?
Obviously, it depends on your definition of sharp. It's going to be a significant increase.
Yeah, but basically, if the baseline has been kind of muddling along, you would see kind of a return to higher sales.
For sure.
That's my point. Okay.
Listen, last Christmas, I went shopping, and because I had recently had COVID, so I wasn't that nervous to go shopping, and there were no stores open. I live in Soho in Manhattan, and one of the things that actually blew my mind was that nobody was open.
Huh. Yeah.
I mean, small stores, big stores, of course, like American Eagle were open, and the Gap was open, and Levi's was open, but any kind of small boutique that normally I like to shop at was closed.
Yeah,
So they weren't even seeking business. So that's where it was. And that's where, hopefully we're gone. We'll be gone from that zone soon.
Okay. Yeah, let's hope, for sure. Let's turn our attention to the Indian textile and apparel industry. India's portion of global trade in textiles and apparel has been kind of stuck at about 5% per year, basically a 5% market share, certainly pre-COVID, for quite a number of years leading up to it. I know many people would be really interested in your sense of the outlook for India as a producer, as well as a sourcing hub for brands around the world. And having said that, I'd be interested in knowing what you see as what are the strengths and weaknesses, and also risks potentially for doing business in India.
Well, democracy is always a risk, because democracy means the workers can ask for more money. So that's a risk, unlike China. So that's a risk there. I think that the biggest advantage that I see going forward is I feel like there's going to be a big desire for vertical industries. And vertical industries means cotton growing nations should make the garments. And that the buyers, the consumers, are going to find value when there's a story that includes the complete transparency and traceability of the product. So I think that it's quite an exciting time for Brazil. I think, unfortunately, it's not going to. China should be taking advantage of that, but they're going to have to recapitulate their story. Uzbekistan is going to have to recapitulate their story. But both of those places have an opportunity. India, as a democracy, has one of the best opportunities, as does Pakistan, to actually harness their supply chain and go into traceability transparently as a strong element of their product, and offer a full package to the market. I think that even though price is still a driving factor and will always be to some extent, I think when we get to thinking about sustainability and the right products will mean places that take care of the entire product range. I think it's very opportunistic for India to think like that.
That's really interesting. How important for Indian producers is it to stress and to adopt and work towards sustainable production?
There is no other production.
Okay.
So
okay.
I mean,
no, go.
that to me at this point, that question is like asking 20 years ago, how important is social compliance? I mean, when you and I started our careers, we didn't care about social compliance so much. What we were interested in is the lowest possible price.
Lowest price, exactly. Yeah.
And then the networks and the TV networks and the media got a hold of workers that were not treated properly. And I think today that the media is going to go after companies that don't treat the environment properly. I don't really see any difference between how the environment is treated and how workers are treated. So I think people will be getting in the weeds on that. And I think that it's the only way to do business today.
How do you think India stacks up with regard to other major suppliers at this point, in terms of the ability to provide high quality, good volume, high sustainability standards, good record on labor practices?
I think India is quite different than, for instance, Pakistan, in the sense that Pakistan really doesn't have a domestic market.
Mm-hmm.
So Pakistan's focus is on export. You know, they have to really pay attention to export because they can't count on their domestic market. I think India has a tremendous domestic market. And so the companies have kind of decisions to make, because some things that are required on the export market are not required on the domestic market. So, you know, which way do we want to go, and how do you run a mill that operates on two different levels? China has exactly the same issues. I think it's a question of mill by mill and what their attitude is going to be and what their strategy is. But if you look at Apple, they don't have a different strategy domestically than they do on the export markets. They make one product quality, they make one standard. Their labor is the rules for their labor compliance are the same everywhere. If you want to be a global company, you have to operate the way Apple does. But in a lot of cases, companies in India operate for domestic one way and for export another way. So I think that's a problem long term, because export requires all your resources and all your attention.
Very interesting. That leads me to my next question, which is really, you know, what are the key trends and purchasing criteria that you see for apparel sourcing? You know, for
I think the long-term trend is really simple. People are going to ask where everything's from. Where is your cotton from? What is the environmental impact of the cotton? Which means that the farmers, and there's a lot of farmers in India, the country needs to figure out how they're going to track the environmental footprint. I think the same thing is going to happen in recycled products. It's well enough to say we're going to use recycled, but where is it from? And how do you prove that? India obviously had lots of problems this year with organic, problems that many of us have thought existed for a long time. So the veracity and the provenance of where things are from are vital today. Even recycled polyester, just because it's recycled polyester doesn't mean we know where it's from. So I think all of these things are leading to a future where we as consumers are going to demand of our suppliers to know where everything's from and who are all the component suppliers, and how do they prove that what they're selling really is, or saying they sold, it really is what it is.
What's the best way for people to really accomplish that, in your opinion? Is it through a service? Is it through cooperation with the government, local authorities? Is it through partnerships in the industry, or is it?
I think you start out with one product and one supply chain, and you perfect it, and then you go to the next one, and you just roll it out slowly. I think it's not something you can say, "Oh, our company just decided to do that." It's not possible.
Gotcha.
You can do it bit by bit and grow slowly and have a commitment, and have whatever it is, a 5-year or 6-year commitment to behaving a certain way, and just go.
Okay, cool. Well, I've got one more question for you. This came from the audience. And the point is made that India's built up a huge capacity in denim.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I think there's a little question about that. What's the future outlook for demand for jeans in light of the whole COVID experience and the fact that so often we may or may not be in jeans? But what's your take on that here and in Europe?
I always find it funny because I'm doing this 44 years. And everybody always says, so what's the demand of denim? First, there was like, when I was really young, the knitted leggings came out. And I remember being with my wife at the mall, and every single woman in the mall was wearing leggings. And she said, your business is over. Well, 2 years later, they weren't. They were wearing jeans.
Right.
I think that the trends that affect the denim demand are knitted generally, that are the most hard to compete against. But knitted is so easy to copy and it's so easy to do that it has a very short cycle. So I think that the general historical trend of jeans is growth of 1.5%, 1.75% over a 10-year period.
It's
And
sort of like it's all like population growth, right? It's more
yeah,
than
so
population growth, really. Yeah.
I think in America and Europe and Japan, we have a very stable marketplace, and the growth will be population growth. They're mature demand. And I think in developing nations, the growth is continuing and the consumption will grow in other countries.
That's terrific. Well, listen, I have to thank you again for taking the time. You're a busy guy, and very much appreciate your participation in this textile conclave that CITI has put on for this year. If people would like to reach you, should they reach you through your website, or what's your preference?
Yeah, they can reach me at andrew@kingpinshow.com or andrew@ola.com, whatever one they want. Or not andrew@ola.com, it's amola@ola.com.
And I should
Or
make the
through
point.
Bob. Or through Bob. Bob knows my email.
That's right. I know how to reach Andrew. And I should also make the point for the audience that Andrew is the founder of the Kingpin Show, probably the premier denim show on the planet. So with that, Andrew, thank you again very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate you having me.
Okay. Thank you.
Good luck.
Thanks. You too. I am delighted today to introduce and welcome to our program Alex Helander. He's CEO of ACH LLC. Alex, how are you today?
I'm well, Bob. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Good.
Let's jump into our questions. We've got a few here, some really good topics, and look forward to talking about them with you. The first is the impact of COVID. It's on everybody's mind. You can't get away from it. We all get that. But I think for our industry, the question that seems to come up time and again is, how has the COVID experience affected the industry? And how do you see the industry coming out of it? Will it be different? Will it be the same? What's your opinion?
Well, listen, I think we all agree that this too shall pass, right? I mean, we're knee deep in it. We're working our way through it. Vaccines are rolling out. So there will come a time when we are moving forward in a better space. Looking at some of the trend lines for it, the decision making that consumers were deciding on at the beginning are starting to decline as we get closer and closer to resolving this pandemic. By that I mean all of the things that we said back in March and April that I'm no longer going to do. I'm no longer going to go to a restaurant. I'm no longer going to go to a public space. I'm no longer going to go shop in brick and mortar. Any of those activities that required physical presence someplace and more. We're doing less of today than we were then. So the latest data on that is, 70% of us were never going to do any of those behaviors a year ago, and now 45% of us are going to be not doing those behaviors. So if you look at that trend line, clearly consumer confidence, personal health and well-being confidence is increasing proportionally to the vaccine rollout. Maybe not, but just the confidence level is going up. I think that as a result of that, though, there's been a trend line, steep increase in the digital presence of how we navigate our lives. And as it relates to our industry, clearly we're seeing more consumer behaviors in that digital space when it comes to purchases of apparel. In other sectors, travel and leisure, which have taken a huge hit as well, those are a little bit further behind, right? People aren't getting on planes yet. People aren't booking travel to destinations. And if they do, the question then becomes, how often do they do that? And at what speed do they come back into it? So I think that while I don't feel like we have reached stasis on this, I do feel like we're starting to come out of it, and we can start thinking about plans and projections as we go forward.
How do you see the recovery in our industry? I mean, the industry will recover. Do you see it as being kind of a V-shaped recovery, or do you see it as more gradual? or does it just kind of bump along where it is right now, and it kind of evolves 5 years from now, 10 years from now?
So I think we could talk about a gazillion different trend lines on that, but I think there's three that I think are important that I focus on. One is economic. How confident are we in our economy here in the United States? How much impact are things such as the stimulus checks, such as low interest, those economic factors, how quickly are they going to give us a shot of confidence to move forward from a purchasing standpoint, right? The second one is forecasting. So for retailers and brands, how do they forecast coming out of this and inventory their position to meet the demand? I think there is a real possibility here for an increase in demand before supply can meet that demand. And that brings up point number three, which is speed. So inherently in our industry, we have long lead times. So if all of a sudden tomorrow or by the middle of March, we see a strong increase in consumer behavior and a demand for product, well, nobody planned for that. All the retailers and brands that I speak to, nobody is planning for an over inventoried position. They never do, and they certainly aren't now. But they are mitigating the downside, of course, by kind of rolling out their inventory, their purchasing, and their forecasting. But some of the economic models show that we might have a fourth Q of 10% plus growth. So that's huge, right? That's almost too hot. But what does that mean? Does that mean we go from low single digit first quarter, slowly move through second quarter, increase in third quarter, so we have a nice smooth trend line that we can really get our arms around it? Or do we go first Q, second Q very low, third Q maybe a little bit, and then explode up more like a hockey stick for that fourth Q? And if we do that, we could really be in a position where the demand is far exceeding the supply at that point in time, and that just brings up a different set of problems.
Well, look, I asked that question because I consider you to be a real expert in sourcing, and you have worked for some of the biggest apparel brands on the planet in your career, and you have a really stellar resume and range of experience that I think is quite valuable for the certainly for the Indian industry as a production hub and a sourcing hub, but also in terms of understanding how the business operates. And I think one of the questions that I know people throughout the Indian industry are asking these days are, what would you see as sort of the key trends and purchasing criteria from U.S. buyers going forward in this environment, as you just laid out so well?
In terms of how they plan to go about doing it?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think that as far as the trend line for that purchasing, it really goes back to the three things that I talked about. Figuring out the space, figuring out the need, and then figuring out how to execute that. In terms of specific product categories, I don't see those changing in the near term. That is, in terms of apparel, those are going to be comfort items. Those are going to be things that we still use in and around our home, whether those are in the athleisure sector, whether they are non-dress up items, if you will. That continues, I think, through the middle of this year. Beyond that, as we gain confidence, as we want to go out, we'll start seeing other sectors in the apparel industries, shoes, handbags, dress up clothing, real adult clothing, something to just make us feel good, that retail therapy that we all seek as a shot of feel goodness from time to time. So I think those trends will play themselves out as we move forward, and as more and more people are vaccinated and the pandemic recedes.
Okay. India has been kind of stuck for the last pre-pandemic. Indian textile apparel exports, or I should say, their percentage, the country's percentage of global trade was typically at about 5% for a number of years now. How do you see the Indian industry as a producer? I mean, what do you see as the strengths, weaknesses? Do you see any risks in sourcing there? What are the opportunities do you see? It's a very large industry for sure.
It's a very large country.
Very large country and has a very large domestic market as well. So what are the opportunities that you see in terms of as you look at India as a sourcing opportunity?
Well, here's the good news, the way I see it. As a country, India has every inherent opportunity to compete globally in just about every single sector that I could imagine. And they compete very well in many. When it comes to apparel and textiles, I think there's a little bit of a resistance on that limiting belief. From the US side, I think there's a limiting belief on capability. What can India produce? These are the areas, the sectors, the items that India has traditionally produced. Therefore, those are the only things that we are going to seek India for in our sourcing plans. From India's standpoint, how have they messaged that? Have they continued to innovate and go forward to increase their presence on the social stage when it comes to innovation? So maybe it's innovation and branding. And let me give you an example of the innovation. Wrapping up 2020, India brought to market just over 5,000 new apparel items to the United States market, roughly 5,000. Well, Vietnam brought to the United States in that same time period about 4,700 items. So you're looking at almost an equal amount of innovation coming from those two countries. And yet you've got India, which has had a presence in the textile trade much longer as far as an export to the United States than Vietnam has. So that says to me, well, wait a second, Vietnam and India, very close, right? Well, if I compare that to China, which had over 11,000 unique SKUs, new unique SKUs in the apparel sector exported to the United States, then I look at a 2x on innovation from China versus India. And so I think that innovation space needs to be addressed much faster. And if it has been addressed, then it falls into the branding, getting that message out, getting the buyers and retailers and those people of influence that are making those buying decisions in the United States aware of the capabilities. And then the last part of that, of course, is aware of those possibilities at a scale that makes sense. It doesn't make any sense if you can innovate and make great things and you can only either do one of them at a time, or you need a minimum order quantity of way too many of them at a time. So that flexibility, we know about the flexibility when it comes to countries like China. We've seen the increase in flexibility in countries like Vietnam. And I don't believe at all that India doesn't have that same capability, but somewhere there's a missing perception that innovation can take place as quickly and as flexibly as some of those other countries. And then I think the last thing to consider with a country like India, the impact of RCEP. So, with RCEP, you now have groups of Asian countries that have gotten together, right? And I know it won't really be final for about another year, the RCEP agreement, but geographically, that's going to have a huge impact. And guess who sits at the top of that? China. So China has now included themselves in a bigger group of influence on competitors to India, right? So that's a challenge that's out there, and India's going to have to address that as well and figure the way around that. But when it comes to India and perceptions to the United States, I think there's a lot of work that could be done just on messaging. I've traveled a lot to India, so I know firsthand that the capabilities are there, the IP is there, the speed can be there. But somewhere between there and here, there's a missing message that I think it's really important to get that over here and really get it honed so that you open the door for more opportunities and move the needle on that 5% that you mentioned earlier.
This leads into my last question. This is actually a question that was sent ahead from one of the audience participants. Is how strongly inclined do you think the U.S. branded retail industry is to over the next, say, 5 years or so, or 6 years or so, to diversify sourcing towards India in light of all the things that you just outlined? Do you see India having the potential to really up its game in terms of attractiveness in the marketplace?
As when it comes to textiles and apparel, I
Yeah.
think that just as I said before, not unless they can ideate at the speed or closer to the speed of countries like China. So if 2020 was, let's call it just under 5,000 units of new SKUs in apparel from Vietnam, and India was just over 5,000. 2021, if Vietnam tips that balance in their favor, that just says to me that India is, I'm proving the point, India needs to ideate faster. There's a lot of innovation taking place. And then even more so, the success of India will rely on that first and foremost, for sure. But let's face it, we are in a place right now where the consumer, doesn't matter the category, wants it fast, wants it unique, wants it better than it was before, and obviously always cheaper, always cheaper, right? But more than anything, it's that convenience. It's that ability to go and get one-stop shopping. And I think we could spend hours on this. The Achilles heel on one end is raw materials. Raw materials to make product in India to export to the United States. India can have a lot of raw material making capacity, but ultimately, most of us are getting a lot of our raw materials, especially in the ASEAN countries and even in India, from China. So they still hold the key to the raw material source. And we talk about the finished product, but the raw materials are still coming from China. So we need more work there too. In certain categories, cotton's not an issue with India, but other categories are, other raw materials are. And I think it needs to really be a focus, because I know as a consumer here in the United States, my attention span has gone from here to here. And my interest in shopping in little silos to get what I need and fulfill my needs has gone to the big boxes where I can get everything that I need. And let's use that as the template for India. Let's get to India, and let's get India going so we can source more from India across a range of products that are of interest, timely, flexible, all the metrics I mentioned before.
Well, Alex, thank you very much for your time today, and it's been a really interesting conversation. You really bring a wealth of information and insight to these kind of questions. If companies want to reach you, what's the best way to reach you?
Sure. Probably the easiest internationally is through my LinkedIn page. So you can find me at Alex Helander. Or my direct email is alexhelander1@gmail.com. So that's my first name, last name, the number 1@gmail.com.
Great, Alex. Well, again, thank you very much for a very stimulating chat. So appreciate it.
Bob, it's been fun. Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, sir. And ladies and gentlemen, we would like to thank the distinguished moderator and all our eminent panelists for sharing their valuable insights on such an important topic and enlightening us with their thought-provoking deliberations.